We are used to measuring war in years, in campaigns, in battles that stretch across seasons. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the entire course of human warfare changed in less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud. 43 seconds. That is how long a single bomb took to fall from a plane before it rewrote what humanity was capable of doing to itself. To understand how the world arrived at that moment, we have to go back to 1939, to a letter written by Albert Einstein and sent to President Franklin Roosevelt. Physicists in Europe had just discovered nuclear fission, the process by which splitting an atom releases an almost unimaginable amount of energy, and there was real fear that Nazi Germany might get there first. That fear was enough to set something enormous in motion. By 1942, the United States had launched the Manhattan Project, a secret research and engineering effort that would eventually employ over 100,000 people across dozens of sites, all working, in most cases without even knowing the full picture, toward a single goal: building the first atomic bomb. By July 1945, they had succeeded. In the desert of New Mexico, the Trinity Test proved that a nuclear chain reaction could be triggered and controlled well enough to become a weapon. President Truman, informed of the test's success while attending a conference in Potsdam, now held something no leader in history had ever held before: the choice of whether to use it. The context that shaped that choice was brutal on its own terms. Germany had already surrendered in May. Japan had not, and by the summer of 1945 the war in the Pacific had become a grinding, devastating campaign of island invasions and firebombing raids that had already killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. American intelligence estimated that Japan had positioned over 500,000 soldiers, along with thousands of aircraft and boats prepared for suicide attacks, to meet an expected American invasion of the home islands. Military planners feared that invasion could cost hundreds of thousands more lives on both sides. Against that backdrop, Truman authorized the use of the new weapon on a short list of Japanese cities. Tokyo and the ancient capital of Kyoto were deliberately left off that list because of their political and cultural significance. The city at the top was Hiroshima, a fan-shaped city of roughly 350,000 people, home to a major army headquarters and a number of war industries, sitting quietly in the delta of the Oda River. Hiroshima's residents had spent months noticing something strange. While other Japanese cities were being reduced to ash by American firebombing raids, their city had been left almost untouched. Rumors spread to explain it. Some believed relatives living in America had somehow petitioned to spare the city. Others assumed it was being deliberately preserved as a future headquarters for American occupation forces. The real reason was colder than anyone imagined. Hiroshima was being kept intact specifically so that when the bomb finally fell, its effects could be measured cleanly, without the confusion of pre-existing damage from earlier raids. At 2:45 in the morning on August 6th, 3 modified B-29 bombers lifted off from the island of Tinian, over 1,500 miles south of Japan. The lead aircraft, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, had been named Enola Gay after his mother. Inside its bomb bay sat a weapon codenamed Little Boy, a gun-type uranium bomb weighing close to 10,000 pounds. Little Boy contained roughly 64 kilograms of uranium-235. It had never been tested. There had been no way to test it beforehand without using up the small global supply of enriched uranium that had taken years to produce. The crew of the Enola Gay were, in effect, about to test the weapon for the first time in the exact moment they used it in war. For most of the journey, only 3 men on board actually knew what they were carrying. To minimize the risk of an accidental detonation during takeoff, the bomb was armed mid-flight rather than on the ground, a decision made by the mission's weapons commander after he had personally witnessed several B-29s crash on takeoff during the war. The rest of the 12-man crew were simply told to expect a blinding flash and were issued protective goggles, with no further explanation. Below them, in Hiroshima, the morning was starting like any other. An air raid alert had sounded roughly an hour earlier when a single weather reconnaissance plane passed overhead, but the all-clear had already been given by the time Enola Gay approached the city in clear skies just after 8 in the morning. Streets were filling with commuters. School children, many of whom had been mobilized to help tear down buildings and create fire breaks against future bombing raids, were arriving at their assigned posts. Nobody in the city had any reason to believe this morning would be different from any other. At 8:15 and 15 seconds Hiroshima time, Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee released Little Boy from roughly 31,000 feet. The moment the bomb left the aircraft, Tibbets banked the massive plane into a steep diving turn, pulling away as hard as the aircraft allowed, racing to put as much distance as possible between the bomber and the point below where the bomb was calculated to detonate. For the next 43 seconds, the bomb fell in near silence, tumbling nearly 6 miles through open sky toward a city that had no idea what was about to happen to it. At 8:16 and 2 seconds, Little Boy detonated roughly 1,900 feet above the city, almost directly above a hospital courtyard near the AIOI Bridge, the very landmark that had been used to help aim the drop. Less than 2% of the bomb's uranium actually achieved fission. It did not need more. In a fraction of a second, temperatures at the point of detonation reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to vaporize human beings within roughly half a mile of the blast almost instantly, leaving behind nothing but shadows burned into stone where people had been standing. Within 1 second, the resulting fireball expanded to nearly 300 meters wide. A shockwave tore outward at close to 1,000 miles an hour, flattening the vast majority of the city's buildings and igniting a firestorm that would burn for hours. 11.5 miles away, already flying at full speed in the opposite direction, the crew of the Enola Gay still felt the shockwave physically strike their aircraft. Tibbets initially thought they were taking anti-aircraft fire. When the crew finally turned to look back, what they saw defied description. A boiling column of smoke, rising impossibly high, swallowing the city whole beneath it. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then, according to the crew's own later accounts, everyone was talking at once. On the ground, an estimated 80,000 people were killed instantly or died within the first hours from injuries too severe to survive. Roughly 70,000 of the city's 76,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. Close to 50,000 were completely leveled. In the months that followed, tens of thousands more would die slowly from burns, from radiation sickness that doctors at the time barely understood, and from a form of injury that had never existed on this scale before in human history. By the end of 1945, the death toll in Hiroshima alone is estimated to have reached somewhere between 140,000 and 200,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them civilians who had simply been going about an ordinary Monday morning. 3 days later, a second bomb, this one built around plutonium and codenamed Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki after clouds obscured the original target. On August 15th, in a radio address unlike anything the Japanese public had ever heard from their own emperor, Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The formal ceremony followed on September 2nd, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, bringing the deadliest conflict in human history to its official close. The scientists who had built the bomb were not naive about what they had unleashed. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the Manhattan Project's laboratory at Los Alamos, would later describe watching the Trinity Test with a mixture of triumph and dread, a feeling that the world had crossed a threshold it could never uncross. He was right. Every nuclear weapon built since, every arms race, every doctrine of mutually assured destruction that shaped the following 80 years traces its origin back to that single 43-second fall over Hiroshima. It is tempting to talk about Hiroshima purely in terms of numbers and physics, the temperature, the blast radius, the yield measured in tons of TNT. But underneath every one of those figures is something far harder to hold. An ordinary city, full of ordinary people living ordinary mornings, that became the place where humanity first proved it could end itself in less than a minute. Hiroshima did not just change the outcome of a war. It changed what every government on Earth has had to consider possible ever since. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most consequential mornings valuable, subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories like this one still waiting to be told.